Probably should have started that walk sooner. Thanks everybody for having me today. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you all. Just wanted to do a little bit more detail about me and as a person, just my professional background. So just some personal stuff. I'm a new dad. Right here is my daughter, Eleanor. She's 4 months old, and we live in Nashville, Tennessee. Born and raised in Iowa, but just loving the new dad life. So, and like the introduction said, I have 10 plus years of comp consulting experience, specializing in base pay and sales compensation and incentive design as well. So, really excited to be talking to you all about all those different aspects of compensation and total rewards. So let's talk a little bit about who Gallagher is and kind of who we are as a company. So we were founded in 1927. We have 32,000 employees, pretty large company nationwide. We actually have an international presence as well. We're the fourth largest broker in the United States, dealing with insurance, but within that, obviously, we do HR and compensation consulting as well. And we have 850 different offices worldwide. So I wanted to kind of overview and kind of discuss like what we're going to cover today in our conversation. I have close to 60 slides on compensation, and hopefully you guys' eyes don't get too droopy at the end of it, but I'm going to do my best to keep it interesting and kind of give you some good insights on what we're seeing today with compensation and best practices as well. So the first thing we're going to cover is just macroeconomic trends in terms of what we're seeing in the labor market as it relates to CPI, so inflation and unemployment. So it's really important to understand those aspects within the economy as we go out to recruit and attract and retain talent, right? And then we'll also talk through kind of more specifically what we're seeing as it relates to compensation trends, right? So what are employees planning to increase their salary budgets by when it comes to merit or total increase budgets? What are employers looking at increasing their total structures or salary structures by or pay bands by for FY25? And then we'll also talk a little bit through pay equity and pay transparency as well in terms of what's coming down the pipeline for that as well within certain states. So if you have offices or locations in those states, how they may be potentially impacted. And then the bulk of the rest of the presentation is going to be just covering compensation best practices, right? So we'll talk through some things around comp strategy, job documentation, benchmarking, building out a pay structure to make sure that you're market competitive when you're going out to recruit and attract talent, slotting your different job titles within that pay structure, administration, and then we'll also talk actually in a decent amount of detail on incentive compensation as well. So if you have sales teams, I'll give you some good best practices as it relates to them as well. So, all right, so what are we seeing today with consumer price increases and inflation, right? So obviously right here on the right is a chart just from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and kind of what we've seen since 2004 all the way up to 2024, right? So generally speaking, inflation had been pretty steady for the last 10 to 20 years, and then we hit the pandemic, right? And it really craters kind of at the start of like 2020, and then obviously it spikes up between 2021 and 2022. With the kind of the peak at February of 2023, I believe. Actually, sorry, June of 2022 at 9%, right? Now, what we're seeing currently, obviously, as of September, the most recent month that was reported was a 2.4% adjusted rate for inflation. So inflation rates in general are cooling to those levels that we saw kind of pre-pandemic, right? So we're kind of cooling off from that point of what we saw those high inflationary periods, right? And it's important to understand this, right, because this also drives to some extent wage inflation and pressures within inflation with that for employers in terms of what they're seeing with that. So, in terms of unemployment, so similar story. So generally speaking, obviously coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, unemployment was pretty high, and then obviously it steadily declined all the way down. And pretty much since 2016, 2018, we've been around 4%, right? Then obviously the pandemic hit, and we saw that huge spike in unemployment that was pretty temporary in nature. And then it pretty quickly came back down, right? So we're now, since 2021, 2022, we're back to those levels that were pre-pandemic. So part of the story that we're seeing with the economy, right, is inflation is cooling down a little bit in most recent years in 2023 and 2024, coming off of those highs in 2022. But unemployment starting to pick up a little bit in 2024, but not to the point where it's super concerning, but is kind of helpful and kind of relieving some of those wage pressure concerns that we're seeing in the economy, right? So as of October 2024, what was reported is a 4.1% unemployment rate. So again, pretty aligned with what we saw pre-pandemic. So, but again, this is important because when unemployment is low, it tends to put on more pressure for turnover and build time to fill in terms of when you're going out to recruit and attract and retain talent. It kind of adds to that factor as well. All right, so I wanted to cover some different survey details in terms of what we know from salary survey benchmarks and a survey that we actually put out every year. So this is the 2024 annual benefits and strategy benchmarking survey that Gallagher does. And you can see we survey over 4,000 organizations as a part of this study, representing over 20 plus industries. We have 300 different questions that span total compensation within that, right? So, and we also have some detail, obviously, as it relates to medical and benefits. That's not going to be in scope for our conversation today, but we do have some additional detail with that as well. So this slide really just kind of summarizes how employers are thinking about compensation and managing compensation from a year-to-year or annual basis, right? So you can see these bars to the right here, or to the left here, that are kind of higher. Across regions and across different sizes of organization, most companies are managing their compensation processes on a year-to-year basis. So if you're not thinking about compensation on an annual basis, you probably need to consider doing that, right? If you want to keep consistent with what other employers are doing, right? It's less common to have compensation planning cycles of 1 to 2 years in nature, so longer than annual in nature. And having a multi-year strategy is actually the least common approach, right? So most employers are thinking about their comp processes and thinking about adjusting their wages and reviewing the market on an annual basis. So in terms of what total rewards aspects employers are most looking to enhance to meet recruitment and retention challenges and objectives, the number one that was reported is base salary, right? So that's the number one factor within total rewards when we look at base salary, variable pay, medical, dental benefits. The number one thing that most employers are looking at enhancing on a year-to-year basis is always going to be base salary, and that's around 78% if we're looking at the full sample in that Gallagher survey, right? So, so that's interesting to note there.
Question for you.
Yeah?
What would be a well-being initiative?
Yeah, so well-being would be more specific to within like health and wellness, within like a medical plan, right? So you might have an employer that chooses to do like a wellness program within that they would offer to their employees, right? That they might get some type of perks or benefits within that, so. Yeah. All right, so in terms of total increase trends, in terms of what we're seeing, employers are planning on increasing their salary budgets by as a percentage of payroll. So what we can see here broken out by non-exempt, exempt, and executive is the leftmost column represents 2022 and the rightmost column represents projected 2025, meaning this is what employers are projecting they're going to do with their employees for the upcoming 2025 year, fiscal year 2025. So you can see, looking at the Gallagher National Survey from that national benchmarking survey that I just discussed, as well as we pull additional World at Work's salary planning survey, which is also at the national level. It's pretty consistently gone down from 2022, going from 4.4 to 4.5% on an annual basis, all the way down to 3.4% on the Gallagher survey, if you're looking at exempt, or 3.5. So somewhere in that range. So we're seeing that cooling, as I mentioned earlier, where employers are planning to increase their payrolls by a little bit more of a conservative amount, given that inflation is coming down as well. Same thing that we see in the national look at the World at Work survey as well. The percentage is a little bit higher at 3.9% for projected. And I will tell you that the World at Work survey tends to include some larger companies in salary survey data set. So please keep that in mind when you're looking at that. So as compared to the Gallagher survey. So any questions on this? So similar type of slide here, but if we ask the question, what are employers planning to increase or move their pay bands by or salary structures by, this is what we're seeing here. And generally speaking, with salary structure increases, they tend to lag payroll increases by 1% or 2%, right? So it's not super surprising to see in the Gallagher survey, we saw in 2025 that it was projected around 3.5%, 3.4%. The salary structure increases, moving their minimums, midpoints, and maximums, is around 2.5%. So lagging about 1% from what the payroll increases are projected at, right? And that's actually pretty consistent with what we saw in the World at Work salary planning survey as well. So. Oh, and I did want to say one other thing about salary structures. You should be moving your pay bands on an annual basis. How many of you all are moving your pay bands up on an annual basis? Okay, perfect. Something to consider. So, because the reason you do that is you're going to fall behind market if you don't do that on a consistent basis. So, all right, pay equity and pay transparency. So we'll talk through kind of what we're seeing here. So pay equity and pay transparency has become a larger focus, especially at the state and local level. So as of January 1 of 2024, states like California, Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, New York, and Rhode Island, Washington, some other select counties have implemented some laws and regulations as it relates to pay equity and pay transparency. And it's probably important for you all to know that going forward when you're administering comp in those areas, right? And it's important to know just because potentially this could happen at some point in some other states, theoretically, right? Just to kind of get a picture of what's coming down the pipeline. So in Minnesota, what we're seeing there, and just to kind of get into some specifics, is for employers that have 30 or more employees in that state, you must have a good faith estimate reflecting a realistic expectation of what is offered for the position. So you can't just offer an open-ended salary range when you're going out to recruit and hire. You have to provide a good faith estimate when you're talking to candidates. And so they do require a little bit more precision when you're having conversations with candidates and recruiting, right, as it relates to pay transparency. And then when you're posting a job to go out and recruit, you must have not only a description of the job, but also a description of the benefits and other compensation that's offered. So that could include health insurance, retirement, bonuses, or any other financial perks that would be associated with that position. So you do need to disclose that in Minnesota when you're going out and recruiting for those positions. The other thing that's included in Minnesota's pay acts are Preventing Pay Discrimination Act is effective in January 2024, which is you are forbidden in Minnesota to ask what their pay history is when you're going out to recruit as well. So, which is actually becoming more and more common in a lot of these states. So in Washington, there's actually some more contingencies and regulations here. So in this case, we're looking at employers even smaller, so 15 or more employees. This would be applicable to in the state of Washington. And you're required to provide any information as it relates to salary ranges with specific positions. So you have to disclose what the specific salary range is. And again, you do have to provide descriptions of the benefits to your applicants, such as vacation days. So this is a little bit more detailed: paid time off, health insurance, retirement benefits. And then you must also list other types of compensation, such as bonuses and commissions as well. And then you're also required, if you meet this threshold in Washington, to list any benefits that provide potential financial compensation to potential employees. And if you violate any of these, then there is a fine associated with this, a penalty of $5,000 for the violation of the law. Yep.
This is kind of a loaded question, and I think I know the answer, but is there any talk on
Not at this moment, and not that I heard of. I mean, this is mostly in, I will say this politically speaking, it's more in blue states or states that are a little bit more on the Democrat side. So we haven't seen this regulation as much in more kind of red states, and so Tennessee would fall into that category.
Yeah,
So.
and I'm curious, are like larger national companies adapting pay transparency even in states that don't require it? Have you seen anything like that, or?
Yeah, so a lot of employers are. So I see a split. So some employers are, if they operate in a certain state, like in Washington, but they also operate in other areas, they might just have a Washington specific policy. But others will say, well, it's just easier for us to just kind of have this policy wholesale across the nation as well. So we kind of see a split. I don't actually have a benchmark that tells you like what percentage, but we do see that kind of occurring. So.
And just so I have to understand this, let's say we all work for the same company, based off of our title, we would know which each other make. That's pay transparency. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of how it's outlined here. So it's more specific to, in this case, in the Minnesota and Washington example, it's more specific to the applicants, right? So you're being transparent about your salary ranges as opposed to the actual specific individual pay. So I don't think you're required to say like you have to know what Susie Joe in accounting's making, for example, exactly. It's more you need to know what the accounting is, salary range is, right? Yeah.
Trap you could fall into is on incentive compensation. If you're changing a plan and one rep is on one plan, you get somebody else you're advertising for a role. So you assume that sales rep can say, wait a second, my comp plan doesn't give me this eligibility.
Right.
It gives, you know?
Yep. And that's like a pay transparency and a pay equity issue as well, so absolutely. Illinois, so the threshold for that employer is 100 or more employees, so a little bit larger employers in that regard. In this case, they actually have to acquire an equal pay certificate from the Department of Labor. That's good for 2 years, and so every 2 years you have to renew this certificate. So you have to get the certificate. Also, you have to submit an Equal Pay Act registration certificate compliance statement that's associated with that. And it's basically just a template that outlines how the business is going to identify and correct any wage or benefit disparities. So any pay equity. So this is going to be more specific to pay equity in this case. So how are they going to resolve any pay inequity that they identify, and how are they going to go about identifying, right? So you have to have some type of statement outline and describing that within the wage laws and its frequency of those evaluations. So how often are you going to do that as well? So you have to outline that as well. And then also what methods are you going to use to determine their actual compensation and benefit as well. So. So let's talk a little bit more about some examples on pay equity and kind of how we could potentially go about reviewing this. So if this is something that's a concern at your organization and you guys are wanting to review this, these are just some examples and kind of some summary level analysis that you could start to be doing, right? So one way to do this would just be breaking it down as breaking all your employees down by salary range, right? So in this example, we have $10,000 increments of base salary ranges. And you can see the distribution of employees there. And here you can see the male-female gender split in terms of their average salary. In this case, in this example, males are making significantly more than females here. So it might be important to understand why is that the case, right? So in this case, males are making more, but they only make about 12% of the total workforce here. So also something to be potentially looking at, right? So you can see the male-female breakdown as well within that salary range breakdown, and most of the females are in the lower tier, kind of down here below, whereas a lot of the males are all kind of more evenly distributed across the full ranges of salary ranges. So. Another payroll audit example on how you could potentially look at identifying a potential pay equity concern. It would be just kind of going through your job titles and summarizing them, just looking at their actual hire date, their experience level, and understanding kind of what is the appropriate adjustment given their experience level as well. So in these cases, the ones that are highlighted red, we found that in this case, these individuals, there was a pay equity discrepancy here, and it's identifying kind of how far off they are from an hourly rate perspective. So this one is just an example, just by job title again, and just more looking at kind of female versus male, kind of averages, the variance to the expected rate given kind of what their average is and overall. And you can identify essentially the female to male pay gap based on this analysis as well. Other things you should take into consideration within pay equity. So generally speaking, look at the classification, so EEO job classification, what their current pay grades are, what the current job titles are, looking at those as well. And then identifying the different protected classes as well, so female over 40 years of age, whether or not non-white or unprotected groups such as male and under 40 and white. So understanding all those different groups as well and kind of segmenting the analysis based on that. And then looking at these things such as average base rate, what are the average total adjustments necessary to make sure that they are more equitable, what does that increase as a percentage payroll look like, and the average experience as well. So because sometimes there might appear to be a pay equity issue, but it might be more due to their actual experience level, right? So if somebody has significant amounts of tenure experience, they're likely going to be paid more than the other person that doesn't have that level of a tenure experience. So,
Hey James,
yeah.
question. So let's say you do this audit and you identify that there are a few females that need to have their compensation adjusted. How do you approach that conversation?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So generally speaking, so I mean, obviously you want to make sure, so we identified that there's an issue potentially there. You want to identify and confirm that there's an issue not only based on the protected class, but also based on the experience level, if the experience levels are equitable as well. And if you confirm all of that, so your question was, how do you have that conversation then?
This has happened to me.
Oh, okay.
Personally,
Right.
where my compensation was adjusted because of a discrepancy that was identified during an audit.
Yeah, I think it's important for the organization to kind of just own it and say, look, we've identified this issue and we're going to make it right with the next payroll cycle or adjustment, right? And just kind of be transparent in how you went about identifying this process as well and identifying and making the recommendation as well. So just being transparent in what you're going to do with that adjustment. So I think it's important to kind of be fully transparent about the process and what was included in that to determine the impact. Is that helpful?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So some additional factors that you could actually use in your pay equity analysis. So I don't know if you remember your stats class, but there's a term called standard deviation. So it's just the average variability, right? So you could look at standard deviation as a way to kind of identify your outliers potentially in your data set, right? So generally speaking, if you think of a normal distribution of employees, around 75% of your employees are going to be between plus or minus 2 standard deviations of the average, right, of that data set. Around 90% of your employees are going to be within 3 of your standard deviations, right? So the number of standard deviations is what we call the Z-score, right? So if you identify employees that have a quote-unquote large Z-score, that's how you can actually potentially identify an outlier in this case, right? And this could also be a way for you to identify some potential problems within your pay equity. So. And this kind of walks through that example as well. So in this case, the example that jumps out here, so service desk specialist, the protected class is making on average $26.52. The unprotected class is making $29 an hour. And so that protected class standard deviation on average is around 34 cents. So they vary about 7.3 is their Z-score from the system average, right? So there's a potential issue there just because given how far off they are, just based on that, right? So this helps us kind of quickly identify these pay equity issues through a statistical analysis process. So, all right. So let's talk through some different compensation best practices and considerations. So overall, in terms of comp best practices, generally speaking, when we look at compensation, we try to follow this process, right? So we like to have, at first, identify and kind of articulate what is our compensation strategy, right? How do we want to go out to market and recruit and attract and retain talent? From an industry level perspective, from a size of employer perspective, from the position in the market, right? Are we trying to compete at the 50th percentile or the 75th percentile, for example? we also want to confirm that we have good job documentation, right? So what that looks like is it could be job postings, it could be job descriptions, but these need to be updated and accurate, right? The reason why this is so critical and important is both the compensation strategy and the job documentation kind of lay the groundwork or foundation for a good compensation analysis or study or process. If you don't have good job documentation, or if you don't have a firm compensation strategy, you're kind of going to be directionless when you're going out and trying to identify what is the appropriate comparator in the market, right? A bad job description could lead you to price a job that's truly not a manager level position as a manager, right? And then you're going to be pulling a higher level market benchmark for something that actually probably doesn't need to be paid that high in the market, for example. So it's important that we have these job descriptions updated. I always say send them over to your hiring managers or your department heads. Just have them confirm and review that. Use job analysis questionnaires and templates to help you kind of standardize that as well. If you need help with a job analysis questionnaire, please contact me after this, and I'm happy to help you all with that process. But it's important to have those firmed up. Then we'll talk more about benchmarking here in a second, but then you want to go out to market and pull the relevant salary survey sources for your data, right, to understand kind of what is the market for this position. After we've completed the benchmarking process, we can then build out what we call a salary structure and update that, right? So that's going to give us our minimums, midpoints, and maximums of what's appropriate to pay that position, right? And generally speaking, we try to target market around the midpoint of that salary range, right? So paying somebody close to midpoint is going to tell you that they're market competitive, generally speaking, right? Because we want our salary structures to be market aligned and also drive internal equity as well. After we've built out that salary structure, we then want to go through all the job titles and appropriately place them into those different pay ranges, right? So generally speaking, a salary structure is going to be anywhere from 10 to 20 different pay grades. Sometimes it goes up to 30 if you have like a large company, but for the most part, it's going to be around 10 to 20. And it's important to appropriately level each position when you're going out and evaluate them, to ensure that they are appropriately in the right salary range given that market, right? And then ongoing administration is also important, right? So after you have everybody placed in there, what are you going to do about addressing pay compression concerns? What are you going to do about your annual merit process, right? So those are kind of ongoing administration processes that are also important as well. So let's talk a little bit more detail about each of these steps. So compensation strategy. So the key questions that we're looking at here is, where are we recruiting? Who are we recruiting? So who are we recruiting against, kind of our industry comparators or competition, the size of employer, for example. And then what is your position in the market, right, from a base pay and total cash perspective. Typically, this is expressed as a percentile in the market. The most common approach, about 90% of my clients I work with, is the 50th percentile, right, the median of the market. However, it might be important for you to be more aggressive or and strategic within certain job groups or departments to help get you high talent, right? So if, for example, like IT positions is one that's very common, right? Where it's difficult to get those positions in the door or those people in the door because their skill set is very much in demand. So sometimes it might make sense to have a 75th percentile comp strategy just for that group, for example. So just to help you be more competitive in that area. So it's important to have a comp strategy in place, but I would recommend being nuanced in your approach. Don't have necessarily a one-size-fit-all approach within your compensation strategy. So. Do all of you have a compensation strategy in place? Oh, okay. Well, talk to me. I'd love to work with you to help develop one. That'd be great. So, but it's really important. I think it's a great resource for you all internally. It's something you can actually communicate to your employees internally as well and say, hey, we're a 50th percentile organization. This is our kind of strategy and philosophy as it relates to compensation and benefits. And then obviously from a benchmarking perspective, it helps kind of guide your process with that as well when you're going out to market to find what is the appropriate market benchmark for this position, right?
So companies that have, let's say, an 80th percentile compensation strategy,
yeah.
When it comes to annual increase in pay, is the recommendation that they, like the 2.5 is the benchmark for 2025?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the 80th percent, what you're saying with the 80th percentile comp strategy is, essentially, I want to be paying above 80% of the other organizations in the market, meaning only 20% of the organizations are going to be likely paying above me. That's kind of what I'm targeting. What I had showed with the 2.5 to 3.4% is actually an average, so that would be probably more closely aligned with the 50th percentile. So if you wanted to be, you probably want to align your salary projections or benchmarks more closely to the 75th percentile, which would be a different benchmark on the salary planning side. So it might be a little bit higher, for example. So maybe you're looking at 5 or 6%. So I don't have that off the top of my head on here, but
So increase that gap.
you would increase that annual adjustment that you do every year, theoretically, if you're trying to be competitive and keep pace with theoretically the 75th percentile of the market or the 80th percentile of the market, right? But the percentile of the market is really just saying this is where on average we want to target our compensation. Now, that's a good point. I wanted to say, so with the market positioning, just because you say you're a 50th percentile or 75th percentile or 80th percentile doesn't mean every single person has to be paid at the 50th or 75th and 80th. It just means on average, that's what you're targeting. So theoretically, you could have some employees that are below that given experience level, right? So generally speaking, that position or the average position is kind of more speaking to kind of your typical employee that has the typical amount of experience, if that makes sense, right? If somebody's new to the role, it's probably not necessary to pay them like right at the 50th percentile theoretically. So is that helpful?
Surprising. Yeah, I guess.
Perfect. Any other questions? All right. So we talked about in the compensation strategy piece, location, right? So where are we recruiting, right? So we tend to think of this from local, regional, or national perspective, right? So generally speaking, kind of rule of thumb, for positions that are non-exempt and professional individual contributors, we typically see that as a more local approach, right? So we're trying to recruit within, like if I have an office in Nashville, I'm recruiting in the Nashville market. If I have an office in Des Moines, Iowa, I'm recruiting in Des Moines. So more of a local approach. But once we get into manager, director, then we start to see kind of typically, and especially at the executive level, more of a national or regional approach with kind of how we're thinking about compensation and recruiting. So it's important to kind of understand that. And then today, do you all differentiate your compensation by location or by geography? Do you have like different pay structures or pay philosophies when it relates to like people in like higher cost of labor markets like New York City or LA versus, you have?
We track effectively the cost of living and just general costs in a market will gross up or we don't tend to gross down. That doesn't really go that way, but when we're hiring a similar position in San Francisco versus Knoxville, Tennessee, it's a completely different comp structure because you'll get an equivalent talent from a skill set experience level, but you just can't pay the same. You're going to basically drop into the bottom 10% of the market on quality.
That's great. No, that's the right way to approach it, in my opinion, especially for your professional individual contributor positions, typically. So, and you said cost of living. So I actually recommend to our clients that we look at cost of labor as opposed to cost of living, just because I don't necessarily want to factor in like the price of housing, for example, or the price of transportation necessarily in my compensation decision making. I want to factor in kind of what's the typical cost of employment within a specific area or zip code, right? And so those are actually different differentials that you can actually pull data from. So we actually have access to that data. If you guys ever need access to that, just let me know. I'd be happy to work with you all on that. But basically, we can pull by zip code, state, or region what is the cost of labor as a percentage of the national average, and that can give you essentially a differential on what that looks like relative to the national average, right?
I'm just curious though, with remote and even hybrid, I guess.
Yeah.
How much does that impact?
It's a good question. So, yeah, it's a great question. So generally speaking with remote employees, and that became much more of a bigger trend, obviously, post-pandemic or within the pandemic, and we've seen a lot of a big movement of like return to work or return to the office, right? But there's still a lot of employees that are remote. But what we see typically, and what we typically advise our clients on with that is to have kind of more of a national approach for them, for the remote employees. Now, if most of their employees that are remote are typically in a specific area and you have to recruit at that area, like for example, it's hard for you to get like anybody outside of LA, for example, you're likely going to have to pay like Los Angeles like market rates for that, right? But if you're able to find like an accountant or an IT professional wherever in the country, then I would say a national approach makes a lot of sense. So, yeah.
I don't know if there's a solution for this, but we found when we're City markets and asking for, demanding it.
Oh, of course they are.
And, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I don't know if there's any real solution outside of, continue to look for the right candidates, but we've just not been able to overcome that where, and the talent has been able to go out and secure those positions at times, and just we lose out. It just is what it is. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to me, there's a difference between the employer asking somebody to live in a specific region or market versus the employee choosing to live in an area as well. So, I mean, the worst case scenario is you pay somebody like Los Angeles market, right? And then they decide to move to Wyoming or Montana or somewhere, and they're making Los Angeles wages in a lower cost of living area or cost of labor market, right? So that kind of is like taking advantage of the employer in a sense, right? So
What do you do in that scenario?
So I recommend personally just sticking to your guns. Now, at the end of the day, you have a full width of a salary range to work with, so there should be some flexibility and discretion, but like set guidelines and thresholds, right? But ultimately, like if somebody wants to be paid Los Angeles rate and there's no business case or reason why they have to be in Los Angeles, and you can find talent elsewhere, then I don't know if it's necessary to pay that, right? We also do recommend, and one other way you could approach it is building out pay zones or pay structures. So pay structures that based on like specific areas, right? So you might have like a national average pay structure and a premium market zone, right? That's like 110% of the national average or 120% of the national average. So 10 to 20% above the average, right? So theoretically, you could also put them on that scale as well and say, okay, I'm willing to meet you kind of in the middle on that, right? And pay you 10% above the national average. So that's another approach as well. So
can I just add, I work for a large cloud software company, and we had geo bands, that's how
Yeah.
they refer to those areas. And if you decided to move from geo band A, which is like a San Francisco, to somewhere like Montana that was like a geo band D, there was an approval process, and it was transparent that your compensation would decrease based on
Yep.
which geo band you resided in. So that's how they handle that at a.
Did they let you know ahead of time, like this is how we do it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
wow.
So that was sort of, you went into that with eyes wide open. that
Interesting.
The compensation would change.
Yeah, that's a little bit more of an aggressive approach. What I've also seen other employers do is they'll redline them, right? So they'll say, okay, if you move to Montana, we're just going to redline you and you're going to be over the maximum and you're not going to be eligible for any increases until the structure catches up with you, right? So,
Yeah.
so that's also,
That's another scenario.
yep, so. But it's important to think about your market competitive pay by location. Be strategic about it. Think about the different areas you're recruiting talent in, and think about all those different factors, right? So, let's see. Yeah, and we already talked about the remote employees versus on-site. So, yeah. Any other questions about pay differentiation by location? All right. Job documentation. So, does everybody in this room have job descriptions for almost all their jobs? Okay, good. You'd be surprised. I ask that question sometimes, and they're like, "We only have job postings," or "We only have job descriptions for some of these roles, and they were updated like 10 years ago," right? So it's good that you have updated job descriptions, but it's important to maintain those. Jobs change, right? The market changes, so just make sure you're doing a regular evaluation of those every couple years, right? Just to make sure that they're up to date. How you go about doing that, you can use job analysis questionnaires. Like I said, I have a template that I can work with you guys on. Typically, it's completed by HR or the management team, and maybe it's a collaborative effort within that. You could also do subject matter expert interviews, and maybe you fill out the job analysis questionnaire as a part of that process. And then when you're doing job descriptions, this is true with a lot of different processes within compensation, but especially with job descriptions. Think about the job, not the person, right? There's always a case where a person's doing above and beyond what the job is saying or doing, but you want to try your best to think about what is this job in a vacuum outside of the person, because if that person were to leave tomorrow, when you go out to recruit, that's what you're recruiting for, right? So think about it from a job duties and responsibilities and what the employer is asking this person to do. You might very well have somebody that's above and beyond and doing a great job and does all these extra things, right? But if it's not necessarily something that you have to have as a part of that job, I don't know if it's necessary to include in that job description. So, job descriptions are important, though. It's good from a recruiting perspective. Obviously, that's what we typically source for a job posting perspective. It's important for us to understand from a benchmarking perspective, because when we go out to benchmark a role or pull market data for a role from a compensation perspective, we're looking at the job description. We're looking at what the job is doing on a day-to-day basis, what are the requirements, what are the educational experience requirements, right? These are all critical to understand what is the appropriate market match. And then it's important from a performance management perspective. So if you're doing a review on an employee, you need to understand kind of what that job is, right? And have that kind of built in to that process. Job descriptions also kind of provide a way of communicating promotional opportunities. So a lot of companies have recently done this thing called career pathing, right? So building out levels of the position, especially within individual contributor jobs, right? So we'll have somebody that could be like, let's say, accountant 1, and they could go all the way up to like senior accountant, right? So, or staff, junior accountant, senior accountant, right? So having that type of kind of career path built out. It's actually very common in engineering roles as well. So building those out is important. And I think job descriptions is a great way to do that. You can also do that through a career path document as well. And then from a legal compliance perspective, it's very important to have job descriptions obviously as well, especially if the Department of Labor is ever questioning on whether a position is exempt versus not exempt. One of the things they're going to look at is the job description as well. So make sure that you have an updated job description for that purpose. Again, update every 3 to 5 years. And the main things you definitely want to include are the summary of what the job is doing, and then the requirements and qualifications for that position. So, benchmarking. All right. So when we think about benchmarking, our typical process is just to identify the appropriate market data, right? So when we're talking about market data, we're typically talking about from salary survey sources or third-party sources such as Mercer, Willis Towers Watson, Aon Hewitt, Culpeper, right? These are all firms that publish salary survey data on an annual basis by position. So it's important that we go through this process, look at the job description, and identify the most apples-to-apples market match. Now, when you're going about this process, you're never going to be able to find something that's 100% spot on to your job. Every job is its own unique snowflake, so to speak, right? So every job is very unique to the organization to some extent. But the goal is to get something 60, 70, 80% comparable, right, at least, to help understand kind of ultimately where is the market for this position, right? And then generally speaking, when we benchmark a role, the result of that process is the summarized market data, right? So that's going to give us our 25th, 50th, 75th percentiles of the market. So that kind of gives us, generally speaking, the full range of the market value of that position from a base pay and total cash compensation perspective. So total cash is going to be base plus any type of incentive paid to that role. So generally speaking, best practice is to target 3 to 5 different salary survey sources if you have availability to that as much as possible. And then identify outliers, right? So when you pull in that salary survey data, if you have 4 different survey sources and one of them's like 20% away from the rest of them, maybe don't include that in your cut, right? And maybe understand, maybe the survey was a little bit off on this data point, right? And kind of exclude that from your benchmark summary. So ensure that when you go out to purchase salary survey data, that it's from a credible survey source. So the firms I just mentioned, Mercer, Willis Towers Watson, Culpeper, Gallagher does a compensation survey as well. They're pretty credible and relevant, right? But there's some firms out there that don't do a great job with this. So make sure that they have some credibility to them. And then generally speaking, when you're benchmarking general industry type jobs, right? Jobs that you kind of recruit across the industry, like your accountants, your IT roles, something that's not as industry specific. You generally don't want to use an industry specific type survey theoretically because you're competing with the broader labor market, right? Now that's a general rule of thumb. You might have some cases where it's really important I get this accountant that's from the energy sector, for example, right? Because I know that the energy sector pays more in this field and we have to have this level of person, right? So there's always exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, for those general type kind of core commodity type jobs, I would call them, right? HR, IT, all those. You can generally kind of use I would use a general industry salary survey and benchmarking those as well. So that's my general recommendation. But for your industry specific jobs, like if it's energy sector, like oil rig or drill mechanic or engineering, go ahead and use a more industry-specific survey, obviously. So, and then keep in mind when you go out and benchmark, it's important to age adjust your market data salary survey data is published one time a year, and sometimes it's published in the beginning of the year, sometimes it's published late in the year, and sometimes it was published 2 years ago. So therefore, you probably want to make some assumptions about moving the market up 2 to 3% each year to ensure that the market data is accurate and up to date, right? So. All right, so just some overview on salary survey sources and kind of how we think about them and some pros and cons, right? So the best case scenario is the published salary surveys that I mentioned. So that's your Mercer, your Willis Towers Watson, right? So the pros for this are going to be, they're obviously high quality data that's from reputable sources and firms, right? So obviously they're very credible and they have a long track record of providing good salary survey data to companies when they're trying to understand what is the market for the position. The cons for this is they can be pretty expensive and cost prohibitive to purchase, right? And sometimes the data can't always be somewhat generic in nature, right? Meaning it's not going to be 100% matched to your job, right? Depending on the positions or depending on the industry, right? So in some cases, it might be better to use more industry-specific surveys, for example, or even build out a custom survey if you have the time to do that. Recruiter surveys like the Robert Half survey, so those are a decent resource. Now, I will say they're not self-reported. It's a good reference point for employees that are actively searching in the market, but just recognize that's a certain subset of the market, right? It's not necessarily the whole market of what's being represented as compared to like a published salary survey source like Mercer or Willis Towers Watson. And recruiter surveys, like a Robert Half survey, tend to be skewed on the higher level. So just recognize that as compared to other benchmarks. Self-reported data, so salary.com, Glassdoor, they're free and you really get what you pay for with these survey sources. They're not great. People are reporting their own compensation in this, right? So somebody could be a junior level accountant and they could put in that Glassdoor or salarysurvey.com that they're a CFO or a controller or an accounting manager, right? So, yes?
Familiar with Lightcast?
I-
Lightcast does job posting data and scrapes salary comp.
Oh.
And aggregates it there. I'm just curious the
I-
position on that. So.
I haven't heard that one, no.
Yeah,
Lightcast?
Yeah, and they do job posting.
Interesting.
So it's kind of up to the minute. So really,
That's great. How do they source that? Do you know?
not 100% sure, but
I'm gonna have to look into that.
years, yeah, and they can drill down on a number of different specs, whether it be geography, job title, industry type, things of that sort. So
That's great.
really, for us, it's been relatively accurate across multiple markets. So.
That's awesome. Very cool. I'm gonna have to look into that. That's great. Yeah, so with the self-reported data, I just take them with a grain of salt. I mean, generally speaking, the quality of the data for that is not gonna be as good as like published salary surveys or even like recruiter surveys. And also the benefit with the published salary survey sources like Mercer and Willis Towers Watson is they have dedicated teams that go through and vet and the data, ensure that it's quality data, right? They ensure everything is accurate and lining up appropriately. There's not really that process within Glassdoor or salary.com. It's all self-reported, so. So there's also aggregated sources such as Comp Analyst, PayScale, ERI. They tend to be a little bit more affordable. So they're usually kind of more of a subscription model, and it's like an annual subscription, and you get access to their database. And what's nice about them is you can really drill down to specific industries within them. So like a PayScale or Comp Analyst, it's really easy to do that. Same thing with ERI or Economic Research Institute. The problem with aggregated sources is they're a little bit black box in nature. So if you have to try to understand like how many people were in this data set or how many companies participated within this benchmark, right? You're not gonna be able to get good visibility to that, right? It's hard to understand what was included in that data set. And I will say they generally tend to be lower on the lower side from a market perspective as compared to published salary survey sources. So keep that in mind as well. The best quality of data, in my opinion, generally speaking, outside of published salary survey sources, is actually building out your own custom surveys. So for example, if you're in the energy sector and you wanted to build out a custom compensation survey that's specific to your positions within the energy sector, you could build that out, right? What's nice about them is you get to choose what job titles are included in that data set, so they tend to be very specific and pretty comparable to your jobs, right? Because you get to build and kind of create what that looks like. And the companies are handpicked, right? So you get to include and decide who is included in that process. So the data is generally pretty high quality. The cons of that approach is it's pretty time consuming, right? You have to build the survey, you have to hope that people respond to the survey, and there's no guarantee on people participating in the survey, right? And if you work with a third party to do this, these can be somewhat costly depending on the number of jobs that are included in that process. So it can be a great option for some companies, though, especially for industries where it's hard to find good market comp data for. So, any questions on this? All right. How many of you all have a salary structure today, like minimums, midpoints, and maximums for your positions? Okay, good. Yeah. So that's great. I think it's an important tool for all companies to have. So it's a good guideline on how to compensate your employees from minimum, midpoint, and maximum perspective, right? So generally speaking, we think of the minimums as kind of starting pay, right? Somebody just new into the position, whereas midpoint tends to represent somebody more proficient, has some years of experience. Maximum represents somebody that has 20, 30 plus years of experience, right? So that's kind of the easy rule of thumb of understanding kind of how a salary structure is typically set up from a pay range perspective. It allows you to administer comp at a more efficient level, right? So we can do merit increases with this process. We can administer new higher compensation, so we have actual guidelines when we're going out to recruit and market. We have like a full width of range, and it helps us understand what's appropriate for that person given their experience level. And generally speaking, when we build out these salary structures, they're market determined, right? So we know that they're competitive with the market, assuming that the midpoints are aligned with your compensation strategy. So generally speaking, that's important as well. And then with your salary structures, I mentioned this earlier, but you want to update these on an annual basis. So make sure that you're continually reviewing these on an annual basis. You're moving them up 2 to 3%. And if you need help with understanding kind of what the salary planning benchmarks are, just contact me. I'm happy to help you with that. So. Here's an example of kind of what a typical salary structure might look like, right? So this is a 27 grade pay structure, and this is actually in an hourly format, but you can see grades 1 through 27. And one thing that I'd like to point out with the salary structure, it employs our kind of best practice approach, right? So with salary structure design, you want to do what we call the upside down Christmas tree or upside down pyramid, right? So your lower level pay grades at the bottom, so grades 1 through 4 in this example, are going to be more narrow. So you see that range column? That's your range spread or how wide the pay bands are. As you move up the salary ranges, those pay bands should widen out to encourage growth and development within that salary range, right? The logic is it's okay to have more narrow pay bands at the lower part of the salary structure because there's going to be more promotional opportunities for that person when they're in grades 1, 2, and 3, for example. But as they move up the organization, there's going to be less promotional opportunities. So those pay bands need to widen out so that they don't hit their maximum quite as fast, right? So. And then this is just some kind of guidelines on how you should think about range administration and administering compensation within the salary range. So 85 to 95% midpoint, typically somebody that's new to the role. We talked about anybody close to midpoint is going to be for somebody that's more fully experienced or fully qualified for the role. And then anybody that's above midpoint or closer to the maximum is going to be for your highly experienced people. So. Job grade placement, so this is just the process of identifying what is the appropriate pay grade for each position. Best way to do that is just looking at the market and then identifying the closest midpoint to that market, right? So if your strategy is the 50th percentile, what's the closest midpoint in your salary structure to that midpoint, to that 50th percentile? You also want to do it based on internal equity, right? So when you're administering compensation and sliding these job titles into your pay structure, you don't want to put a supervisor in a pay grade that's lower than a direct report, obviously, right? Or you want to make sure that jobs that are pretty equivalent in skill and complexity and scope should be in similar pay grades. So you want to ensure you're balancing internal equity with this process. Yeah.
I don't see up here, what we've seen is departmental disparity as well. Like where marketing may be in a certain range, and it's hard to apply the same title and range to IT or
Yes.
operations or sales even. So an added complexity is departmental. And so do you recommend a whole different scale or maybe a variance based on percentile or percentage?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So when we think about that from that perspective, I tend to start breaking it down from a level of scope and responsibility, not necessarily specific to the department, but just like is this an individual contributor? Is it like somebody that requires a bachelor's degree and 2 years of experience? Somebody that requires a bachelor's degree and like 10 years of experience, right? Like what scale of job are we looking at, right? Is this somebody that's managing huge projects or small projects, right? So I kind of try to break it down to those levels, and that helps it be a little bit more comparable across departments. So that's one of the ways I kind of get around that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it can be a little bit difficult and tricky when we're looking across departments. I typically don't recommend building out a whole new salary structure unless there is a market-driven reason, right? So, for example, IT is a classic example. So some companies will have a structure just for IT positions because they just need it to be competitive in the market, right? So they have a whole different pay structure and pay ranges for IT positions just to kind of ensure that they're competitive with the market, right? So, bless you. So administration of comp, so it's important to have merit increases as a part of this process. So just every year you should be increasing your employees, and typically with a merit increase or a cost of living adjustment, if it's a flat increase, you should be increasing them based on their performance evaluation score. That's generally the best practice with that, right? And then using some type of merit matrix, right? So employees that get a 5 on their score get this percent. Employees that get a 4 on the score get this percent, right? And some people will use merit matrices that are even more complex, where they'll vary it based on where they are in the salary range as well, and try to focus on giving their higher increases in their merit to their lower in the salary range people, because those are your kind of most at-risk employees from a turnover perspective, right? So. Pay compression. Another thing that you want to look at is identifying pay compression issues. So when you have these salary structures in place, do you have people new hires that are now leapfrogging your existing employees that have less experience than your existing employees? So leapfrogging in terms of compensation, right? So how do we identify your pay compression concerns, looking at kind of their experience level, their performance, and properly moving them to the appropriate position in that salary range, giving their experience or time and job is important as well. And we can offer support in financial modeling and building out an analysis to help identifying those pay compression concerns. Building out salary administration guidelines. So it's kind of like an HR handbook, but within compensation, having a kind of a documented process on this is how we administer compensation as an organization. And then new hire calculators are also great. This is just a tool to help you kind of consistently administer compensation for your new hires coming into the organization. So, all right. So incentive comp, we'll talk a little bit about some of that as well. So incentive comp typically involves just identifying kind of strategies. So how are we kind of targeting our incentive comp from a strategy perspective? Are we focused on sales, profitability? Do we want it to be market competitive? Is the strategy going to be dependent on the type of role, obviously? Then you want to be doing some plan evaluation and assessment, right? So we can offer support in focus groups, interviews, doing cost of sales analysis, pay for performance as well, ensuring that you have the appropriate plan design as well. So do you have the right measures in place? Are your maximums appropriate, or do you have your plans be uncapped based on sales comp plans, for example? And we can talk a little bit more detail about that. And there's additional support that you all should consider in terms of plan implementation, so building out plan documents, incentive calculators, and then doing ongoing analysis as well. So generally speaking, so this is going to get more specific to sales compensation, so think about this. From a sales comp perspective, our goal always is to try to shift the performance curve to the right? When we think about percentage of quota as an organization, we want to move as a whole to the right. We want to increase in volume and growth, right? And sales compensation can be an effective tool to help kind of leverage that, right? So it's important with sales compensation. The best companies that do it have a process with sales strategy in terms of how they're going to go out and attract and target their customers and products and sell their products and services. And from that, they also understand what type of sales jobs they have, right? Do we have hunters? Do we have farmers? Or do we have more of a hybrid role, right? And then from those, we can build out appropriate aligned sales comp plans in terms of commission and bonus structures to help motivate and attract those employees. And then we can employ like a 10 key decision point framework to help us kind of identify what that looks like in terms of plan design, right? And help properly assess the plans as well, looking at the roles, eligibility, upside, quotas, the mechanics of the plan, ongoing administration, for example. This is just a helpful tool to help us understand, does this role even need to be eligible for a sales comp plan? You'd be surprised, there are some companies that have people on commission structures or in sales comp plans, and they're not really doing a lot of sales activities, right? So it's important to understand and kind of assess that as well. When we talk about sales comp, it's also important to understand pay mix as well. So percentage of compensation that's going to be in base pay versus percentage of compensation that's going to be incentive as well. And so we can properly assess this as well in terms of understanding what makes sense, right? So we have the spectrum of somebody that's on a full commission plan to somebody that's on full salary. And then the answer might be somewhere in between, given kind of the elements of their job and kind of the focus, right? And then if we think about the effects of pay mix, so somebody that's kind of focused on 50% of their comp or more is going to be on incentive or commission, that's going to be their primary driver, right? So if you're on a 40-60 or 50-50 pay split, you're going to be very focused for the organization getting sales for that company, right? That's going to be your primary driver. On the other side, if only 10 to 15% of their comp is coming on commissions or incentives, it's more of a reminder. They're not really going to be that focused or driven on it, right? So just think about kind of that from a strategic high-level perspective. It's also important to provide the right amount of upside given the earnings potential and their performance as well, right? So if you have top 10th percentile or 90th percentile performers, how are you paying them out relative to the median performer, right? Versus your bottom performers, right? How's that look? A lot of companies are paying too much for their lower performers and not enough to their top performers is what I see. That's kind of the big takeaway when I work with a lot of companies on the sales comp side. And this graph just kind of shows kind of an approach, right? So if we think about the bottom, if somebody's making $100,000 in base salary, their target incentive for the year is $50,000. Between 0 and 100% of their sales quota, they could be getting 0 to $50,000 on that incentive, right? And then the real question is, what happens after they exceed their sales quota, right? So between 100 and 133% of their sales quota, what does that look like, right? So it might be more attractive for a sales team member to have a plan that's on that blue curve as opposed to that curve that's got the upside on that dark side right there, where it's the one-to-one upside, right? So it's important to kind of look at that, right? And also, obviously, we got to model out quotas appropriately as well. So you don't want to be giving out huge, large windfall payments to somebody that doesn't actually deserve it. So, and this is just an example of kind of what I was talking about earlier. So best practice is we want somebody that's at the 90th percentile in payout to be making on average 3x or 300% of the median payout, right? So that's kind of the upside illustration, right? Whereas somebody that's in the bottom 10th percentile of their sales comp or commissions, they should be making about 25% or a quarter of what the median payout is, right? So this is kind of how we can properly potentially evaluate how a current commission structure is aligned with the best practice, right? So in this case, this group was actually paying way too much to their low performers and not enough to their high performers, as you can see on these curves. When you're looking at your sales comp and incentive plans, just make sure that you're factoring these things, right? Are your performance measures strategic, controllable? Are they measurable, right? With sales comp plans, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's typically bookings, revenue, or sales, right? Or invoices, right? With other incentive structures, it might not be as clear cut. So, and this kind of goes into more detail about that, right? So typically for a lot of companies that use like MBOs, so management by objectives or KSOs, that might be more of a common approach where like it's not as clear cut or defined on a quantifiable measure like sales or revenue, right? But they have key core objectives for the year that they need to achieve for the company to feel comfortable paying them out on an incentive, right? So that's gonna be more of your subjective and kind of judgment measures. Whereas at the top, that's gonna be more focused for your salespeople, right? So, so there's different ways to think about these measures. And again, this is kind of similar to the pay mix slide that I had earlier, but when you're weighting performance measures, so you might have a plan that has 3 to 5, well, typically we don't recommend more than 3 measures, but let's say you have 3 measures. You want to be cognizant and aware of how you're allocating and weighting those incentive measures, right? So if you're weighting a measure more than 50%, they're definitely going to be focused on it. If you're weighting something less than 15%, they're probably not even going to care about it. So you might as well not even weight it. So just think about it from that perspective, right? So, and this is just a helpful kind of guide, right? Something that's more than 50% is going to be a clear driver, whereas something that's less than 15% is going to be more of a reminder. So. This is just kind of how we define different types of sales comp plans. So there's two kind of core sales comp plans, right? We have your typical commission-based plan, which is a percentage of revenue, versus a quota-based bonus plan, right? And both of them can be upside, uncapped, unlimited potentials from the upside. So that's not the differentiation necessarily, but there might be a different focus with each of these, right? So in some cases, it might make sense to have a true commission plan, whereas in other cases, it might make sense to have more of a quota-based plan, right? So it's important to kind of understand all these different characteristics and see what is appropriate for your organization. So this slide I like a lot because it kind of talks through quota setting and kind of understanding how should your kind of performance distribution generally look, right? So generally speaking, 50 to 60% of your employees should be hitting quota or exceeding it, right? And then the remaining really 40 to 50% should be below quota, right? So that should be the distribution or split. If you're seeing only 20% of your people getting quota or exceeding it, you might be setting quotas a little too high. If you're seeing 70% or 80% of your employees exceeding quota or hitting it, you might be setting them a little bit too soft, right? So that's one way to kind of think about it. Payout timing, right? So that's also an important characteristic to think about, right? So generally speaking, the key differentiator or the key thing to think about here is just the length of the sales cycle when you're on a sales comp plan or commission plan. How long does it take to make a sale, right? It probably doesn't make sense to pay somebody monthly if it takes 5 years or 3 years to make a sale, right? On average. But if it takes them a month or 2 or 3 months, maybe a monthly quarterly plan might make sense, right? And then this also talks about kind of different approaches on different types of sales type roles, right? So for your hunters, they're going to be true people, true business developers going out and trying to find and identify new business and selling new products and new services, right? And doing more prospecting. It might make more sense to have them on a commission plan with a higher mix of base pay, a higher mix of variable pay in their pay mix, right? So more of their comp coming from at-risk or commission incentive. Versus, and they're going to have less measures that they're going to focus on. Whereas somebody that's more of a farmer or a true kind of account manager or customer service type role, they might be more aligned with a bonus plan, right? So all that to say, so this is just kind of a wrap-up slide in terms of just how to think about compensation and just total rewards as well in general, right? So it's important to think about compensation, but we also have to think of the bigger picture, right, from a total rewards perspective, because all these things matter when it comes to recruiting and attracting and retaining talent, right? It's not just compensation, it's not just the base pay and the incentives, but it's also the benefit plans, the retirement, the PTO as well. That's important when you're going out recruiting and attracting talent as well. And then the other thing that employees are looking at are, do you have career paths? Do you have a promotional opportunity track for them to move forward in the organization, right? Do you have flexible work arrangements? These are things that people are looking at and asking for in some cases. And then in other cases, they might be looking at other things like, do they feel safe at work? Is the work environment safe? Do they feel like the company's pretty stable, or is it a pretty shaky company that has bad financials and they feel like they're going to lay off a bunch of people, right? These are all things that employees think about from a well-being perspective as well. So when you're building out, so we talked about compensation strategies, so this is more on total rewards philosophy. Things that you need to consider, just kind of key influencing factors on what's going to ultimately drive them to come work for your company. And clearly define on what is included in your total rewards process, right, in terms of base pay, incentive, but the whole picture, right, retirement, PTO, and everything. You want to also kind of understand and define what is market when you're defining the total rewards, how you want to compete from a total rewards perspective. And then ultimately, it should end up being a statement of how that company aligns with compensation, including variable pay and benefits, right? All right, that is pretty much it. I'm happy to go through and address any questions and talk through any more detail, but I have a QR code if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. My email address is also on the deck as well. I'll send out the slide deck to the, Paul, should I send it to you, directly to you? And
Make sure they get it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
yeah, that'd be great. Perfect. What questions do you guys have?
On the non-pay issue, right, the other issues, is there a hot one that companies are like, hey, we're really looking at well-being programs, or we're looking at whatever it might be, I don't know, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that sticks out and we get a lot of requests on is PTO, like paid time off is actually one that's pretty common. So vacation time what's interesting is like a lot of employers are looking at maybe doing unlimited vacation, but there's a potential downside with that as well, right? They can't accrue anything, and it's unlimited, really actually unlimited. Do they feel like they're comfortable actually taking that, right? So, but we have benchmarks on what other employers are doing with that as well, and that's something that we can certainly help with. So,
do you have an analysis of how much generations value the different level of well-being versus benefits versus compensation?
you know, I don't have an analysis. I can kind of speak anecdotally, kind of what I typically see in terms of everything, right? So generally speaking, almost all employees are always going to value base pay and compensation, right? Because at a certain level, they need that to survive and to live and to be competitive in the market, right? But other things like, so older generations obviously are going to favor retirement benefits, and they're going to look at that, right? Younger generations might be more interested in like career growth and promotional opportunities, for example. So if they're starting fresh out of school, what's their runway at that company, right? So having a defined process on that is important. So I mean, it just depends on the role in the group, right? So salespeople are going to be attracted to sales comp plans, right? That are lucrative in nature. So it's not just a generational thing, it's also the type of person that you're recruiting, right? So
is there anything to, let's say like an hourly employee at a low hourly wage, their weight on compensation is extremely high, 90% plus.
yeah.
But as that pay increases, that weight decreasing, is that a trend as well? Is there a certain kind of tipping point where when you're talking 150 grand or 250 grand, the weight on the compensation piece of it really reduces?
Yeah, so generally speaking, so kind of starting from bottom to top, right? So if you think about traditionally somebody that's hourly or clerical, most of their comp is going to come from base pay, right? They might be eligible, and in some cases, we typically see in our benchmarks, 50% of employees that are in non-exempt roles are eligible for an incentive, meaning the other 50% aren't eligible for incentive, right? So in a lot of cases, that's 100% of their compensation, right? And then they'll obviously get the other associated benefits if they're eligible in terms of medical, dental, and all that. But as they move up the organization, what we typically see is the incentive piece become a larger portion of their comp. And especially kind of jumps when they get into that director executive level, because then you start talking about long-term incentives, right? So it might be at the professional level, like it might be like 80 to 90% of your comp is coming from base salary, and the remaining 20% is incentive. And then it might be more of a 30-30-30 or 30-30-40 split at like your executive level, right? Between base, short-term incentive, and long-term incentive is what we generally see. So
for sales compensation, do you usually see like that employers start over at the beginning of the year, like with regard to like, you know, their like the incentive components, or do you usually see it carry over on like a 12-month roll?
yeah, so the best practice, and what I typically work with clients on, is I typically advise them to use to be measuring their performance on an annual quota, so measuring their performance on a whole year. But then if they're paying them on a monthly or a quarterly basis, then you're just getting paid out year to date on kind of like a true up, right? So how their progression against that annual quota would ultimately basically impact their payout, right? So in Q1, they would get that payout, then anything incremental in Q2, they would get that incremental payout, right? So from a quarterly perspective example. But there's different things you want to consider with that. But generally, I typically think that annual quotas make the most sense, even if you're paying them out on a monthly or quarterly basis. So did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully this was helpful and insightful. I know it's a lot of information, and hopefully it wasn't too boring, but hopefully there was something to be gained from this, so, yeah. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well.